The transfer no one is told about inside the journey to ADX Florence. In the American prison system, most major events come with paperwork, explanations, and at least some sense of warning. Sentences are read in court. Transfers between facilities are usually announced days or weeks in advance. Even disciplinary actions come with written notices and timelines. But there is one kind of transfer that breaks all of those expectations. It begins without explanation. It unfolds without confirmation. And it moves forward without ever telling the person at the center of it where they are going. This documentary is about that kind of transfer, not the decision that starts it, not the prison that ends it, but the journey itself. A period of uncertainty where information disappears, routines dissolve, and movement replaces identity. For some inmates, the first sign that something is different comes early in the morning, not through an announcement, but through silence. No schedule posted, no destination listed, personal property gathered without context, questions unanswered, not aggressively, but completely. Inside the system, this silence is intentional. The prison does not confirm where the inmate is being sent because confirmation changes behavior. Knowledge creates anticipation, resistance, or preparation. The system wants none of that. What it wants is compliance without expectation. So the transfer begins as a sequence of controlled moments. An inmate is removed from their normal environment and placed somewhere temporary. A holding area, a transit unit, a space designed not for living, but for waiting. Time becomes unclear. Hours stretch. Days blur. And still, no destination is named. This is not chaos. It is design. The American prison system relies heavily on movement. Inmates are shifted between units, facilities, and jurisdictions constantly. But when the destination is meant to carry psychological weight, the system delays naming it for as long as possible, because uncertainty is a form of control. During this phase, the inmate exists between institutions, no longer belonging to the place they came from, and not yet admitted to the place they are going. Their identity inside the system becomes temporary. Records follow them, but people do not. Staff change. Locations change. Rules shift slightly from one holding space to the next. Each transition removes another layer of familiarity. Even experienced inmates, those who understand prison routines, find this phase disorienting. There is nothing to adapt to because nothing stays still. Meals arrive without a predictable schedule. Lights turn on and off at unfamiliar times. Instructions are brief, procedural, and stripped of context. The inmate is not told why something is happening, only what to do next. Move here. Wait there. Pack this. Sit down. The journey is not about speed. It is about detachment. Every hour spent without information separates the inmate further from their previous environment. Their mental focus shifts from resistance to endurance, from planning to waiting, from identity to compliance. This is the moment when the system feels largest, not because of force, but because of distance. The inmate may pass through multiple facilities without ever knowing their purpose. Short stays, temporary holds, spaces that exist only to connect other spaces. None of them meant to be remembered, and yet each one leaves a mark. By the time the destination finally becomes clear, sometimes days or weeks later, the journey has already done its work. Expectations are gone. Assumptions are erased. The inmate arrives not just in a new place, but in a new mental state. This documentary explores that invisible stretch of time, the movement without explanation, the waiting without answers, the transfer that is never announced, but always felt. Because in the prison system, the most powerful part of transfer is not where it ends. It is what happens before anyone knows where they're going. The day nothing is explained. Most prison transfers begin with information. An inmate is told days in advance that they are being moved. A destination may be listed. A reason may be given. At the very least, there is acknowledgement that a change is coming. Even when the move is unwelcome, it follows a familiar pattern. But the transfer explored in this documentary begins by breaking that pattern entirely. It starts on an ordinary day. There is no announcement over the intercom, no paperwork handed through a slot, no explanation delivered by staff. Instead, Routine quietly collapses. Schedules change without warning. Normal movement pauses. The inmate is instructed to prepare without being told what for. Pack your property. Wait. Questions receive no answers, not because staff are hostile, but because they are not authorized to say anything. The silence is procedural. It is part of the process. This moment is where uncertainty first takes hold. The inmate is removed from their usual housing area and placed somewhere temporary, a space that does not feel permanent, a holding area, transit unit, or intake-style room designed for short stays. These spaces are intentionally neutral, bare, devoid of personal detail. They are not meant to become familiar. Time behaves differently here. Hours stretch without markers. There is no routine to follow, no activity schedule to anticipate. Meals arrive inconsistently. Lights may remain on longer than expected. Staff rotate without explanation. Every small detail reinforces the same message. Nothing here belongs to you. The most unsettling part is not discomfort. It is the absence of context. In normal prison life, inmates adapt by learning patterns. They memorize routines, anticipate counts, and adjust behavior based on expectations. During this phase, expectations are deliberately removed. The inmate does not know how long they will remain in this space, or what comes next. This uncertainty is not accidental. By withholding information, the system prevents preparation. There is no chance to rehearse reactions, plan responses, or brace emotionally for a known destination. Instead, the inmate is forced to exist entirely in the present moment, move when told, wait when instructed, comply without understanding. For experienced inmates, this can be more destabilizing than overt restriction. Knowledge is one of the few forms of control an inmate usually retains. When that knowledge disappears, the balance shifts completely. During this stage, identity inside the system becomes temporary. The inmate is no longer associated with a specific housing unit or facility. They are in transit, a category that exists outside normal routines. Staff interactions become brief and functional. There is no relationship, no continuity, no familiarity. The system becomes impersonal by design. Every transition reinforces the same condition. You are no longer anchored to where you were, and you are not yet allowed to know where you are going. This is the psychological foundation of the transfer. Before movement even begins, the system separates the inmate from certainty. It narrows focus. It strips away anticipation. What remains is compliance driven not by fear, but by exhaustion from not knowing. By the end of this stage, something subtle but important is already changed. The inmate stops asking questions, not because they have been answered, but because they no longer seem useful. And that silence marks the true beginning of the journey. Property without a destination. One of the first things the prison system removes during an unannounced transfer is not freedom, movement, or even routine. It removes ownership. When the inmate is told to gather their property, the instructions sound simple. But inside a prison, personal property is more than belongings. It is structure. It is memory. It is continuity in a place designed to erase both. The process begins quietly. Items are removed from the cell under supervision. Some are allowed to stay together. Others are separated immediately. Property is checked against inventory lists that the inmate does not control. Questions about what will travel with them are ignored, not as punishment, but because answers are unnecessary. At this stage, even staff often do not know the final destination. Everything is labeled for movement, not arrival. Boxes are sealed. Bags are tagged. Paperwork is attached without explanation. What matters is not where property is going, but that it leaves at the same time the inmate does. From this point forward, the inmate and their belongings may not travel together. That separation is deliberate. Property becomes symbolic during this phase. The inmate realizes that nothing they own is guaranteed to remain accessible. Items that were once part of daily routine, legal papers, letters, photographs, religious materials, are now suspended in transit, just like the person they belong to. This creates a subtle psychological effect. Without property, the inmate loses reference points. There is nothing to organize time around, nothing familiar to return to after waiting. The holding space becomes total. It contains everything the inmate has access to, and nothing more. Meanwhile, paperwork continues to move independently. Transfer forms, chain of custody documents, and temporary intake records circulate through administrative channels. The inmate does not see them. They are not meant to. These documents exist to track movement, not to inform. The system functions on parallel tracks, one visible, one invisible. As hours turn into days, the inmate may be moved again, sometimes without notice, sometimes late at night or early in the morning. Each move is procedural. Short instructions, minimal interaction, no explanation of whether this is temporary or permanent. The phrase, "you're just passing through," is never spoken, but it is implied everywhere. Holding spaces during this phase are intentionally interchangeable. They are designed to feel the same regardless of location. Blank walls, fixed lighting, minimal sound. The goal is not comfort or punishment, but neutrality. Neutral spaces prevent attachment. This is where the sense of destination begins to dissolve. The inmate may attempt to read signs, listen for clues, or infer meaning from staff behavior. But the system is careful. Staff rotate frequently. Interactions are brief. No one stays long enough to become familiar. Even experienced inmates, those who understand prison logistics, find this phase disorienting. The usual markers are gone. There is no intake orientation, no explanation of rules beyond immediate compliance. Everything is provisional. What makes this stage particularly powerful is how ordinary it appears from the outside. There is no visible force, no confrontation, no escalation, just movement without context. But internally, the effect is cumulative. Without knowing where they're going, the inmate's mental focus narrows. Long-term thinking becomes impossible. Planning disappears. The mind shifts into endurance mode, concerned only with the next instruction, the next wait, the next transition. This is not accidental. The system understands that uncertainty weakens resistance more effectively than restriction. When nothing is explained, there is nothing to argue against. Compliance becomes the only workable response. By the end of this phase, the inmate may not even care where they're going. What matters is that the waiting ends. And that shift, when destination becomes less important than relief, is one of the most critical transformations in the entire transfer process. Because once that happens, the system no longer needs to manage expectations. It has already removed them, moving without a destination. When the actual movement begins, it does not feel like travel. There is no sense of departure. No clear beginning. The inmate is not told, "You're leaving now," or "You are being transferred." Instead, movement arrives in fragments. Short instructions delivered without context, doors opening and closing, a sequence of spaces that feel disconnected from one another. This is how the system moves people without allowing them to feel moved. The inmate may be relocated at irregular hours. Early morning before the facility wakes. Late night when routines have ended. Timing is chosen not for efficiency, but for control. When the prison around you is quiet, movement feels heavier. There are fewer reference points, fewer witnesses, less sense of orientation. The process is procedural, not forceful. Instructions are brief. Stand here. Wait. Follow. There is no conversation, no explanation. Not because staff are indifferent, but because information is restricted by design. In many cases, even the staff escorting the inmate are not told the final destination. Their role is limited to the next handoff. This fragmentation is intentional. The prison system divides responsibility so that no single person carries the entire narrative. Each staff member handles one step, one space, one transition. That way, movement feels continuous to the system, but disjointed to the inmate. As movement continues, the inmate begins to lose track of geography. Facilities blur together. Corridors look the same. Holding rooms share identical layouts. Lighting remains constant. Sound is minimal. The environment offers no clues about distance or direction. Even the concept of location becomes abstract. The inmate knows they are moving, but not how far. They may pass through multiple jurisdictions, without realizing it. A county hold becomes a federal hold. A transit unit becomes another transit unit. Each stop is temporary, but none are clearly defined. This in-between state is where the system holds the most power. There is no opportunity to prepare mentally for arrival, because arrival does not exist yet. There is only continuation, movement without resolution. During this phase, time stretches in unnatural ways. Minutes feel long, hours feel suspended, days lose definition. Without routine, the body adapts by conserving energy. The mind stops anticipating. The inmate may begin to focus on small details, the sound of footsteps, the change in air, the rhythm of doors closing. Not because they offer meaning, but because they are all that remains. This is where uncertainty becomes physical. The inmate's posture changes. Movements become slower. Reactions flatten. Not from fear, but from fatigue of not knowing when the process will end. The system does not need to enforce compliance aggressively. The structure itself does that work. Every transition reinforces the same condition. You are not in control of where you're going. Unlike standard transfers, there is no sense of progression, no milestones passed, no confirmation that movement is nearing completion. Each stop feels as provisional as the last. And because the system does not confirm anything, the inmate is left to interpret silence. Is this temporary? Is this another holding point? Is this a destination? None of those questions receive answers. Over time, the questions stop forming. What replaces them is a narrowed awareness, focused entirely on immediate instructions. The inmate stops thinking about tomorrow or next week or what comes after. The present moment becomes total. This is not accidental. The prison system understands that anticipation fuels resistance. When people know what is coming, they prepare. When they do not, preparation becomes impossible. The system removes foresight so that movement can continue without friction. By the midpoint of this phase, the inmate no longer experiences transfer as a process. It becomes a condition. Being moved without knowing where becomes normal. Waiting without explanation becomes expected. The absence of information stops feeling strange and starts feeling permanent. This is the psychological core of the journey. Before any destination is reached, the system ensures that the inmate arrives without expectations, without assumptions, and without the mental leverage that knowledge provides. And once that state is achieved, the remainder of the journey becomes purely logistical. The inmate will continue moving, but internally, something has already settled. Not understanding has been replaced by acceptance. The system between prisons. There's a part of the prison system that most people never see, never hear about, and rarely understand. It is not a prison in the traditional sense. It is not a place where sentences are served, and it is not meant to be remembered. This chapter takes place in that space. Between departure and destination, the inmate passes through a network of holding environments that exist solely to keep movement uninterrupted. These spaces are not designed for living. They are designed for containment during transition. The system refers to them casually. Transit units, temporary holds, processing centers, but their purpose is far more specific. They ensure that the inmate never fully arrives anywhere until the journey is complete. These spaces are deliberately interchangeable. Walls are bare. Lighting is fixed. Furniture, if present, is minimal and immovable. There are no markers of identity, no personalization, no indication of where the inmate is within the broader system. The environment offers nothing to anchor memory or orientation. This uniformity is intentional. When every place looks the same, movement loses meaning. The inmate cannot distinguish one stop from another. The journey becomes continuous rather than segmented, which prevents the mind from resetting. Staff interactions in these spaces are brief and impersonal. Officers perform specific tasks, checking identification, escorting movement, verifying paperwork. But they do not linger. There is no conversation, no explanation, no acknowledgement of duration. The inmate is processed, held, and moved again. Sometimes the stay lasts hours. Sometimes it stretches into days. The difference is never explained. This unpredictability creates a constant state of readiness. The inmate never knows when the next movement will occur, so rest becomes shallow. The body remains alert, even in stillness. Sleep, when it happens, is fragmented. This is not a result of harsh treatment. It is a result of not knowing. During this phase, the system operates at its most abstract. The inmate is no longer associated with a specific facility, housing unit, or classification group. They exist as a moving record, a set of identifiers and documents traveling ahead of them through administrative channels. Their physical presence lags behind the paperwork. This creates a strange inversion. The system knows exactly where the inmate is in the process, but the inmate does not. Each transfer point represents progress toward a destination that remains unnamed. The journey continues, regardless of awareness. In these holding spaces, time feels suspended. There are no routines to measure days by, no work assignments, no recreation periods. Meals arrive without pattern. Lights follow schedules unrelated to the inmate's internal clock. The environment enforces passivity not through force, but through absence of structure. The inmate becomes a participant in a process they cannot observe. What makes this phase particularly powerful is how it strips away the illusion of choice. There is nothing to negotiate, nothing to influence, nothing to resist. Compliance is not demanded, it is assumed. The system does not need to assert authority here. The architecture does that work. As days pass, the inmate may begin to feel detached from their previous identity. Memories of the last facility blur. Familiar routines fade. The sense of belonging to any place dissolves. The journey becomes the only reality. This is the moment when the transfer stops feeling temporary, not because it has lasted long, but because there is no sign of conclusion. The inmate may stop tracking time entirely. Without information, days lose relevance. The only certainty is that movement will resume at some point, without warning. And when it does, it will happen the same way it always has. Quietly, procedurally, without explanation. This is how the system maintains momentum without resistance. By the time the inmate leaves these in-between spaces for the final phase of the journey, they are no longer oriented toward arrival. They're oriented toward endurance. And that shift away from destination toward survival process is exactly what the system intends. When the destination finally becomes clear, for most of the journey, the system survives on silence. Information is withheld. Movement is fragmented. Time is allowed to stretch without explanation. But eventually, the journey reaches a point where silence is no longer necessary. Not because the system becomes transparent, but because the outcome can no longer be avoided. This is the moment when the destination begins to reveal itself, not through an announcement, not through confirmation, but through accumulation. The inmate may notice subtle changes first, a shift in staff behavior, a different tone in instructions, the presence of personnel who operate with a higher degree of formality. Nothing is said directly, but the environment begins to feel more deliberate. Paperwork becomes more specific. Identification checks are repeated more carefully. Names are verified multiple times. Documents are reviewed with greater attention than before. These actions do not provide clarity, but they signal that the journey has entered its final phase. This is when the system tightens. Movement becomes less frequent, but more purposeful. Transfers between holding spaces slow. The inmate may remain in one place longer than before, though no explanation is given. The stillness feels different now, not indefinite, but preparatory. The body senses it before the mind does. Uncertainty begins to narrow. Where earlier phases were defined by not knowing anything, this stage is defined by knowing something is ending. The waiting has shape now. The silence carries weight. At this point, the inmate may attempt to piece together clues, not through direct information, but through pattern recognition. The type of facility, the level of security, the equipment used, the behavior of staff. Experienced inmates understand these signals. They know when the system is no longer improvising. They know when the destination has already been set. What makes this moment especially powerful is that it arrives after resistance has already been worn down. The inmate has spent days or weeks adjusting to uncertainty. Expectations have been erased. Mental preparation has been replaced by endurance. So when recognition begins to surface, it does not produce panic. It produces stillness. The The system has achieved what it needs. The inmate is no longer reacting emotionally to the unknown. They are ready to absorb whatever comes next. This is not mercy. It is efficiency. When information finally becomes unavoidable, it is delivered indirectly, through language used around the inmate, not to them, through forms that no longer look provisional, through procedures that no longer feel temporary. Sometimes the destination is never spoken aloud until the final stage. The inmate may infer it before it is confirmed, or they may hear the name only once, in passing, without explanation. ADX Florence is not introduced dramatically. It does not need to be. By the time the destination becomes clear, the journey has already completed its psychological work. The inmate is no longer oriented toward understanding the system. They are oriented toward surviving it. What remains is acceptance, not the destination itself, but a lack of control. The realization settles quietly. This is where I am being taken. This is not a stop along the way. This is the end of the journey. There is no confrontation at this stage. No protest. No reaction that would alter the outcome. The system has already ensured that such reactions no longer serve a purpose. The inmate is moved again, but this time the movement feels different. It feels final, not because of force, but because of clarity. This is a paradox of the prison transfer system. Clarity arrives only after resistance has been neutralized. The destination becomes visible only once knowing it no longer changes anything. By the time the journey reaches this point, the inmate has already been transformed by what came before. The waiting, the silence, the movement without explanation, all of it reshaped perception and expectation. The destination is no longer the most important part. The process was, and that is why the system invests so heavily in the journey itself. Because by the time the destination finally becomes clear, the transfer is already complete in every way that matters. The psychological cost of being moved without identity. By the time the journey reaches this stage, the inmate is no longer reacting to movement itself. Movement has become normal. What begins to change instead is something quieter and far more lasting, the inmate's sense of identity inside the system. In ordinary prison life, identity is shaped by routine. An inmate knows where they are housed, what unit they belong to, which officers recognize them, and what role they occupy within the structure of the facility. Even under strict control, there is familiarity, a sense of placement. During prolonged transfer, that placement dissolves. The inmate is no longer from anywhere. They are not associated with a housing unit, a job assignment, or a consistent population. Staff do not recognize them beyond paperwork. Other inmates, if encountered briefly, do not register as social reference points. There is no continuity long enough for relationships, positive or negative, to form. This produces a specific psychological effect. The inmate stops seeing themselves as part of an environment and begins seeing themselves as an object being processed through it. This shift does not happen suddenly. It unfolds over days of repetition, holding space after holding space. Short stays followed by abrupt movement. Each transition reinforces the same message. Nothing here is meant to include you. Language plays an important role during this phase. Instructions become shorter, more mechanical. The inmate is referred to by identifiers rather than name. Conversations, when they occur at all, are stripped of context. The system no longer speaks to the inmate. It speaks around them. This further erodes identity. Without feedback, without explanation, without acknowledgement, the inmate's internal dialogue changes. Questions disappear, not because curiosity is gone, but because curiosity has no reward. Instead, attention narrows toward bodily regulation, posture, breathing, endurance. The mind turns inward. This is where time becomes especially distorted. Without identity markers, days stop separating themselves from one another. Memory compresses. Events blur together. The inmate may struggle later to recall the sequence of movement, because nothing was distinct enough to anchor recollection. This is not confusion. It is adaptation. The brain reduces detail when detail no longer serves survival. From the system's perspective, this adaptation is functional. An inmate who no longer expects explanation is easier to move, easier to manage, easier to contain without resistance. But the cost of this adaptation is subtle and long-lasting. The inmate begins to experience themselves as temporary everywhere. Even rest feels provisional. Even stillness feels conditional. There is no sense of being settled, because settlement has been intentionally denied. This has consequences. Emotion flattens. Reaction slows. The body conserves energy not because it is calm, but because it has learned that nothing it does changes outcome. The system does not need to apply pressure. The absence of control applies it automatically. This is why prolonged transfer is so effective. It does not break people through force. It dissolves them through uncertainty. By this stage, the inmate no longer anticipates arrival with hope or fear. Arrival is no longer a goal. It is simply another transition that will happen when the system decides it should. This is the moment when compliance becomes internal, not because the inmate agrees with what is happening, but because resistance has lost its shape. Without identity, without destination, without context, resistance has nothing to push against. The system has reduced the inmate to motion without meaning. And once that happens, the final phase of the journey becomes easier for everyone involved. There are no reactions left to manage, no expectations left to disappoint, no identity left to destabilize, only movement. This is why the prison system invests so much time in this phase. Not because it is necessary for transport, but because it prepares the inmate psychologically for what comes next, whatever that may be. By the time the final destination is reached, the most significant transformation has already occurred. The inmate arrives not as someone entering a new place, but as someone who no longer expects place to matter. And that is the quiet cost of being moved without identity. What the journey leaves behind. By the time the transfer finally ends, the system no longer needs to explain anything, not because answers are available, but because the questions no longer matter. The inmate has passed through spaces that were never meant to be understood. Holding rooms without names, facilities without memory, days without markers, movement without explanation. Each stage stripped away a layer of expectation until the journey itself became the only reality. This is what makes this kind of transfer so powerful. It does not rely on force. It does not rely on fear. It relies on time and uncertainty. The prison system understands something fundamental about human behavior. People resist what they can anticipate, but they adapt to what they cannot define. When the future is unclear, the mind narrows. Long-term thinking disappears. Survival replaces strategy. That is what this journey is designed to produce. By withholding information, the system removes leverage. By fragmenting movement, it removes orientation. By delaying destination, it removes identity. What remains is compliance that does not need to be enforced because it has already been internalized. When the destination finally becomes clear, it no longer arrives as a shock. It arrives as confirmation. The inmate does not arrive with questions about why they were moved. That question belongs to an earlier version of themselves, one who still expected explanation. Instead, arrival feels like an endpoint to a process that already did its work long before the final door closed. This is a part of the prison system that is hardest to see from the outside. There are no dramatic moments, no visible turning points, no single action that explains everything, just a slow narrowing of options. And once that narrowing is complete, the destination feels almost irrelevant compared to the journey that led there. What remains afterward is not just confinement, but residue, a lasting awareness that movement can happen without warning, that identity can be suspended without explanation, and that control does not always need to announce itself to be effective. This is why transfers like this are remembered long after sentences are served, not because of where they ended, but because of what they took away along the way. Understanding this process forces us to rethink how power operates inside prisons. It shows that control is not always loud or visible. Sometimes it is quiet, procedural, and patient. Sometimes it works by removing certainty rather than applying pressure. And once certainty is gone, it does not return easily. The journey ends. The destination remains. But the effects of uncertainty linger. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe.